Welcome back to the second video in our series, thinking about rational thinking, thinking about logic. Today we're going to continue our discussion about arguments. What is an argument? What are the argument forms? What are the main argument forms? And we're going to look at just as a preliminary analysis into how we can evaluate arguments. So recall in my first video, I made some pretty big promises. Essentially, do you want to see the world more clearly? Maybe you're reading a book for school or you're reading a book at work and there's an expectation that you'll understand it. Maybe you're going to do a presentation on this thing for your employer, but you're reading through the material and you just can't make heads or tails of it. Or again, at university, writing a paper, you want to get a good grade, you want to get an A+. These skills in understanding how language works, more specifically how logic works in language, and being able to identify argument parts and you evaluate them will serve you in all of these ways. I hammered home in the previous video how there's very practical significance in terms of how you make medical decisions or economic decisions. All of these things flow from our understanding of what has strong worth, what has strong in terms of ideas, in terms of the best course of action to take. And how do we understand or discern that given all available options? And my argument was that it was arguments, that we should be thinking about how to argue logically and rationally, and that is one way of making our lives better. Okay, so just at a surface level, a couple of things. You may have heard of these phrases before: deductive and inductive. Deductive and inductive. These sound a little odd, I understand. But there's also a phrase, validity. And strength. We're going to look at those. And then we're going to ask the question, in terms of a practical skill, how can we take something that seems convoluted from a book or an article or a Facebook post and draw it into the real world, literally drawing it out to help make sense of it. Diagramming is the title for that. Okay, so we've already established that in the real world where we exist, we want to connect to the real world as clearly as possible, and to do that we need reasons for why. We need evidence, we need plausible ideas or plausible reasons for why something is or is not the case. The two terms, deductive and inductive, refer to how secure the conclusion is. How secure the conclusion is. In a deductive argument, and there are famous examples, we'll look at a couple in just a second, but in deductive arguments, it's said to be valid when the premises absolutely guarantee a conclusion. There is no wiggle room. Deductively valid arguments are said to be truth-preserving. That's kind of a fancy way that if you go from, to use my example from the previous video, my conclusion is I should eat pizza. I'm going to eat pizza. And I use examples of because it's healthy, because it's cheap, because it tastes good. The idea is that if this was a deductive argument, if these premises were true, they guarantee the conclusion that eating pizza is a good idea. Now the reality is these truth-preserving arguments are relatively rare in life, but it's important that you know the difference. It's a big difference that will inform how you make decisions, because many people in life will try to convince you that their arguments are deductive. That is, that they're absolute, they're beyond the pale, the truth is guaranteed in that conclusion. But when you look closer, you realize, well, actually, maybe it's not absolute. Maybe these premises don't guarantee a conclusion. And if that's the case, it still may be a good argument, but if that's the case and it's being overstated as secure, you're on very good ground to question it. You should be questioning it anyway, but to really question it, to decide whether it is a healthy course of action. So we have this thing called deductive. Here's the classic example of a deductive argument where the premises lead to a conclusion. That is, the reasons for why my conclusion is true, they're guaranteed by these premises. All men are mortal. All men are mortal. Okay, that seems to be true, unless you have evidence to the contrary. Socrates is a man. Socrates is an ancient philosopher, but Socrates is a man. Being a man is mortal. Okay. The two premises are, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. If these are true, and they happen to be true, then this conclusion follows necessarily, absolutely. You cannot wiggle out of this conclusion, which is that Socrates is mortal. If all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, if both of those are true, Socrates is mortal. There's nothing you can do about it to change that truth. That is a deductive argument. I like deductive arguments because I don't need to question them beyond that. Socrates is clearly mortal. No, I can question them more if I want. I can question whether all men are mortal. I can question whether Socrates really is a man. Maybe we need to get a DNA test to see if he has the right chromosome. We could redefine what we mean by man. We could do a lot of things to try and change it. But as it is, this is a very powerful argument. Nice. The word validity comes up now, and it's squishy in a couple of ways. Validity. You've probably heard it said many times. Well, that's a valid point. Well, that's a valid point. Well, that's a valid argument. That's a valid position. So in our language, in English at least, valid means good. Valid means strong. That's a good argument. It's a strong argument. I buy what you're saying. But what if the word valid doesn't actually mean that? Now we can have a big debate upon whether technical words that have the unique meaning mean it, or whether words being used in the vernacular, how most people use them, actually means what the word means. But in this case, at least, traditionally speaking in philosophy, the word valid refers to logical structure, not whether the argument is good or not. We're going to make sense of this, but it refers to logical structure, not whether the argument is good or not. In fact, some really strong arguments, they may not be absolutely deductive, but some very strong arguments are not valid. Yeah. So imagine or suspend, if you can, the word valid just long enough to make sense of this. The word valid as you know it. Valid means the conclusion follows logically from the premises. If you have true premises, you have to have a conclusion. That's valid. If you have true premises, you have to have, that's valid. A deductively valid argument. True premises guarantee a conclusion. I know I'm repeating myself. I'm saying it slightly different. Let's consider an example. All right, so here's a silly example. All Wedgwood teacups, and I don't know if there's a company actually called Wedgwood teacups, but anyway, all Wedgwood teacups circle in orbit around the planet Mars. So imagine there are these teacups going around Mars, okay? My mother claims to have a Wedgwood teacup. So she claims to have one of the cups, but we just said in the previous premise that all of these cups are circling Mars. Therefore, the conclusion, my mother is mistaken in her claim that she has a Wedgwood teacup, as absurd as this example is. A deductively valid argument says that if the premises are true, the conclusion must follow, and there's no wiggle room. So, if all Wedgwood teacups do circle Mars, and if my mother claims to have one, we have a contradiction. She must be mistaken that she has one. Maybe she has a knockoff, a Chinese knockoff or something of these Wedgwood teacups. What am I saying? The content seems weird. Teacups circling Mars, that seems crazy. But that's not what we're focused on. We're focused on if hypothetically, if the premise is true, and if this premise is true, then the conclusion must follow. That's what valid means. Valid does not literally mean that she does or doesn't have a teacup. It's hypothetical, whether or not she might and whether the teacups circle Mars. That's not what we're focused on right now. So that's one of the reasons these examples are absurd. It helps us kind of get away from whether we think they're actually true. We're just looking at this weird logical form, the logical form that says valid, premises guaranteeing a conclusion. And this will make more sense as we go and we look at more complicated parts. We're just kind of getting some basic terminology right now. So to repeat myself again, I apologize. Valid arguments do not mean strong arguments. right? Just because it's valid doesn't mean it's strong. I don't think any of us were convinced about the teacup thing, but we'll get into more examples in just a second. So on that basis alone, invalid arguments may actually be pretty persuasive, and many of us may live our lives accepting invalid arguments and be the healthier for it, which is again the opposite of how we use the word in language. So that's why it's tricky. So is this valid or invalid? Valid or invalid? Remember, you're asking, do the premises guarantee the conclusion? That's what you're asking. That's a silly example. All pigs are purple. Obviously, that's not true, but let's just say it is. All pigs are purple. Bingo is a pig. You've never met Bingo, but let's say Bingo is actually a pig. Remember, we're doing the hypothetical that that it is true. We're just going to give it the benefit of the doubt. All pigs are purple. Bingo is a pig. What follows? Absolutely, that Bingo is purple. That is an absolutely valid deductive argument that we can feel really confident in. If pigs are purple, and if Bingo is a pig, we know he's purple. That's a great assurance. And in science, that's the kind of thing that they seek. They seek these natural laws that are absolute and that don't change. Let me drive this point home, that whatever validity is, it has less to do with the real world and more about this logical structure in language or logical structure in thought. With this example, all Splarkuses are slobber bombers. All Splarkuses are slobber bombers. That probably didn't make sense to you because I made those words up. But let's consider that premise one. All Splarkuses are slobber bombers. Ted is a Splarksids, whatever that is. Ted is this thing, Splarkids. Therefore, I may conclude that Ted is also a slobber bomber. If the first premise is true and the second premise is true, then I can go to sleep at night knowing that this Ted person, whatever it is a slobber bomber, whatever that is. None of this makes any sense, but the logical structure is there. And the reason we talk about the logical structure is because we can now plug real life into this logical structure and decide, oh, is this a deductively valid argument or not? So as weird as it is, now we can plug real life into that sort of thing. Here's an example of another argument that I need you to ask yourself, do you think this is valid? Do you think the conclusion is absolutely necessary because of the reasons given for why, or the premises? So according to the Environment Canada website, whatever, according to Environment Canada, there are only 2 years in the last 60 years for which there was no snow in April. So according to Environment Canada, the experts in weather, in the last 60 years, only 2 of those years had no snow. So in April, there's snow, except for 2 times. Okay. Therefore, it will snow in April of this year. So this is the kind of thing you'll hear from other people on the news. You'll hear these sorts of things. They take a stat. They take it from a reputable source like Environment Canada. These are experts in their field. And assume for the moment that that's true, that there have only been 2 days in the last 60 in which, or 2 examples of this, in which there was no snow in April. Then we can conclude that in fact it will snow in April of this year. The problem is that while this is a very strong argument, it's not guaranteed by the premises. Why? Because we have examples in which there was no snow over the 60-year period that they're talking about. It's not guaranteed. Is it highly likely that it will snow in April? And the answer is yes. It is highly, highly likely, and you would be well within your right reason to assume it's going to snow in April. But it's not guaranteed. This is huge. What is guaranteed and truth-preserving, deductive, versus what is likely the case, or maybe unlikely the case, but in this case it's likely the case, that's not truth-preserving. In the first case with the deductive argument, if you go through these premises and you deny the conclusion and you say no, you're contradicting yourself. So the example of Ted being a slobber bomber or the teacups or something, if you say no to one of these premises or to the conclusion, it doesn't make any sense because the conclusion is guaranteed. But here, to say no to that conclusion, there's some justification to it. There's some justification to say to this person, hey, you know what? It's true. What you're saying, it's highly, highly unlikely to be no snow in April. There's probably going to be some, but it's not guaranteed. There is a world of difference now between what is guaranteed and what is likely the case. And if we can get our heads around that, what we will find is that 9 times, I'm exaggerating now, but 99.99% of the time, when a politician says this as if it were deductively valid or deductively true, it's probably not. When they say, I'm going to raise taxes on the elite and give the wealth to the middle class, that's probably not a deductive argument, however they're presenting it. It's one of those things where once you see the distinction, you begin to see it everywhere. And in fact, most arguments that we hear in life are not deductive, even though they're presented as that. They're inductive. Inductive as this probably true. So let me give you the definition for inductive arguments now, because we were talking about inductive arguments with the April example. An inductive argument succeeds in providing probable logical support, and we would call that strong. That is a strong argument. If it fails, we would call it weak. So again, most arguments in life will have this strong character to them, where they provide probable evidence, if it's a good argument, rather than deductive absolute. Here's my favorite one that really kind of drives home inductive reasoning, or inductive, so not deductive. All polar bears observed in human history have been white. I don't think that's true, but obviously we're just going with the logical form here. Try not to get caught up on whether or not they're actually white. All polar bears in human history have been white. I've heard of pink ones and whatever. For different reasons, their fur is a different color. There have been thousands of observations. So all the ones ever observed have been white. There have been thousands of observations. Therefore, all polar bears are white. Okay, let me think about that. I've never gone out to observe polar bears, but let's try and think about the truth value of this. If it's true that all polar bears have been white and thousands of observations have been made, people going out to look, then I would feel pretty certain that in fact all polar bears are white. Here's the problem. It's not guaranteed. They used to think that all swans were white. Logic textbooks were written using white swans as an example. And then somebody went to Australia and they found black swans, and the logic textbooks had to be rewritten. Even though thousands of observations had been made and all swans were white, oops, turns out there are black swans. So that wasn't a deductive argument. And the linchpin, or the hinge mechanism here, the problem here, is that while you may have made thousands of observations, human observation isn't absolute. And there may be an example hidden somewhere, maybe in some dark cave somewhere. There might be a black swan waiting to screw up all of your logic textbooks. So, again, most examples in life will be like this. We've made a lot of observations, and all of our observations have shown us this. Like with vaccines and vaccine responses. And at this point, billions of vaccines have been given out, COVID vaccines, and they've observed X, Y, and Z problems with them with people, and they haven't been bad. They haven't. Overall, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, so you need to look at this on your own. But overall, they can say that the vaccines are safe and effective because they have thousands or billions of observations and all these different things. But that's still not a deductive approach, because it's based on probability rather than this absolute. This is the case. So inductive arguments are said to be not truth preserving, but they might be the most persuasive and they might be the most helpful, even though they're not called truth preserving, because there's that squishiness. So if we take our first Socrates example, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man, that deductively valid argument, and we mess it up to make it inductive, we would say almost all humans are mortal. Maybe I have a buddy of mine who, transcended into heaven or something, and he never died. And Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is probably mortal. Probably is the key term. And that's why we need to be critical rational thinkers, because so much of our understanding of the word, also world is what I meant to say, is based on this probability, what is likely the case. And it's kind of heavy lifting to figure it out. How much evidence do I need? How much exposure to looking for polar bears do I need before I conclude they're all white or not? So this has practical significance. Knowing inductive from deductive will help condition whether we accept authorities who are trying to present something as deductive when it's not. It's just probably true, or maybe it's not even probably true. Maybe it's very unlikely, but at least it falls into that other column of not being truth preserving in that way. I'm not a fan of that, saying it's not truth preserving, because in fact, every very strong inductive argument, very much, if it's good and it's strong and it has merit to it, it has truth in it. It has truth in it. So that's a bit misleading, but that's the tradition. Let's move on and talk about judging arguments. So this is already implied, and I'm sure you do this in your own life already, but let me just spell this out. Kind of a few steps to this. So when you come across an argument, maybe it's how to invest so that you have lots of retirement income, or maybe it's on a car you should buy and people are suggesting buy this car versus that car. Anyway, when someone comes to you and here's an argument, your job is to figure out what the conclusion is. And that can be a bit tricky. What does this person want me to believe? And sometimes they're not even clear on that themselves. A little ambiguous, a little vague. But you want to figure out, okay, what does this person want me to believe? So that's the conclusion. Where is all this stuff going? Because maybe I've gotten it written out in a textbook and it's a long sheet like this, if I can go through a piece of paper and I can find that conclusion and circle it, then I realize everything else must be a premise that's supporting it, or a sub-argument that's supporting that one big conclusion. And then I need to ask, are the premises true in a way that guarantees the conclusion? Is it a deductively valid argument that if this is true and if this is true, this is the best car on the planet? Maybe I'm looking at a Tesla 3 or something, and the things they're saying, and it leads to this realization deductively, this is the absolutely best car on the planet. Or is it the case that we're dealing with probability or induction, that it's likely true? You know, maybe the Tesla's not perfect, maybe there's some issues, and I'm not being forced to conclude anything, but it's still a strong argument that I should buy the car. Deciding those two things after you've found the conclusion is really helpful, because that helps you weigh how the premises are supposed to act. And at that stage, you're asking, are the premises actually true? Or are they lies? Because companies advertise things all the time and their details aren't very clear. Which leads me to my next point. When you're trying to evaluate or judge an argument, you've found the conclusion, you have some sense if it's absolute or if it's probable, if it's deductive or inductive. You have some sense of what these premises mean and whether or not they're true. What you will probably discover is that there are missing parts. And this happens all the time because, as I said, companies advertise the best and there are gaps in the reasoning as to why you should buy this car. This is a common practice of many advertising agencies to let consumers make a leap or to imply a usefulness of a product or a good relationship with a product. So they'll, in the previous video I talked about how milk is labeled natural, but the word organic has been classified as a good thing, as a value. And it's not even clear what organic is. It's fascinating actually to hear all of the different examples. So if we try and make sense of what organic is by finding out the missing parts, we're doing ourselves a favor of clarifying what does that mean. So the question becomes, we have all of these companies making advertising claims, we have these politicians and everybody who wants to vie for our attention, and we're hearing these arguments and we know they're not clear, and we have some sense that they're missing pieces. Oftentimes the pieces are missing because there's a hidden premise or hidden reason for why that is perhaps unsavory. That is, that if you really realize the argument and what was involved, you wouldn't like it. It's controversial, so they don't want to advertise it because people will pick up on it as being controversial and there'll be a debate where they don't want one. Or it may just legitimately be presented in a way that the person doesn't know what their argument is. They don't have the premises clearly spelled out. So what do? We have to decide whether or not we're going to fix those missing pieces. If you want to, you can. But the general rule is when an argument comes to you and it's poor, it's missing pieces, it's not clear, it's not your job to fix somebody else's argument, unless you want to. And I would argue that that can be fun and healthy and advantageous to everyone. But if you're going to fix somebody's argument, you better do it fairly and nicely, or else you're committing a straw person fallacy, or traditionally what's called the straw man fallacy. So let's talk about that. There are really two big parts to this. One is what's called the principle of charity in interpretation. The principle of charity says, do your best to understand the other person. Take their argument, whatever their argument is, maybe it's about marshmallows and storing up for winter, or pizza, or healthcare, or something. Take it and find the most plausible premises, the most robust, the strongest that you can, and then work with that argument. If you find that really there aren't any premises that work, the argument may be unrepairable, in which case you can point it out to the other person that I don't know how we're going to make this argument of yours work, at which point there's not a whole lot you can do except to call it a day. But if you're practicing the principle of charity, what that means is that you won't be making a straw person fallacy, which we see all the time. It's one of the dominant fallacies we see on the news and in the media, where someone who, say I like Bernie Sanders. So say I don't like Bernie Sanders. I actually do like Bernie Sanders, but let's say I don't like Bernie Sanders. He has some pretty radical views regarding the redistribution of wealth and what we should be doing with money and healthcare to help people. But instead of looking at his arguments directly, I will, as someone who's against him, just rage against socialism and call him a communist. I will tell anybody who listens that he's just another Russian stooge. He's in the pocket of China. Communism, communism, communism. And I'll try to make any of his arguments look as bad as they can. What I'm doing is not taking him seriously, not taking his arguments seriously. I'm repackaging his profile or his platform into something that's easy for me to dismiss, or easy for something for me to destroy. When people look at actual arguments, they do this with actual arguments too, not just that they make people look bad, and they pervert a premise, or they make it look weaker than it actually is to make it easier to reject. Well, if you're repairing somebody else's argument, or your own, but especially when you're repairing somebody else's argument, please practice the principle of charity. Be cool. Avoid that straw person fallacy. All right. Two forms of arguments to consider. Well, three, really. There's this thing called hypothetical logic or conditional logic. And it's straightforward in a way. Conditional logic says, if this, then that. If this state of affairs, if this action, if this thing happens, if this is real, then that will be the case. So if I get a vaccine, then that. If I don't get a vaccine, then that. If we launch a rocket into outer space, then that. So that's the kind of logic, and it's everywhere. So here's a silly example. If aliens landed in Roswell, New Mexico, then they must exist. Aliens did land in New Mexico, therefore they exist. The logic form there is called a conditional argument. It's technically called affirming the antecedent, a modus ponens, the way of affirming. But we'll get back to that in just a second. The argument, if then, is very powerful and persuasive. Again, there are two forms that people tend to talk a lot about. The way of affirming. Sorry, I just got lost in my notes. There we go. And within this logic of if-then, we have two parts. The first is the antecedent. The antecedent, fancy term, it's the if part, and it usually comes first in the sentence. So the example, if aliens landed in Roswell, New Mexico, is called the antecedent. So if you want to show off at a party, now you know what an antecedent is. The consequent is the then part. Then this happened. So it usually comes after, not always. So we have the antecedent, if, then we have the consequent, the then part. Then aliens exist. So If they landed in Roswell, New Mexico, then they must exist. So that's the conditional stuff going on here. If you really want to make it fancy, I'm going to put it a screen here. Whoops. I'm not going to do that screen at all. There we go. I think that works. No, it's not working. Yes, it is. Okay. If you want to make it a little fancier, we're going to add a little Latin now. Here's the first example I want to talk about. If the job is worth doing, then it's worth doing well. The job is worth doing, therefore it's worth doing well. That's the if-then logic stuff that we see all around us. Now the fancy part of this is that affirming antecedent. So it's affirming this thing called the antecedent we just talked about, the if part. It's affirming it. To affirm something is to say yes, to support. To deny, of course, or to negate is to take away support from, or to say that that's incorrect or something. Now the Latin, and I'm giving you the Latin because this is traditionally when talking about logic, this comes up time and again. Modus ponens, the way of affirming. This is the example. If the job is worth doing, it's worth doing well. The job is worth doing, therefore it's worth doing well. This is the logic at hand. This is the logic we're looking at. I'm going to highlight it one more time. Oh man, this is hard to highlight for some reason. The logic is if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now if you're looking at that thinking, what in the world is he talking about? P and Q are random letters. Now they're not random. The tradition in logic, these have been used traditionally in logic, but we could put in X and Y, or we could put in something else. We could put in any kind of placeholder. But if the job is worth doing well, you can see it spelled out in more detail here. If the job is worth doing well is P. Then Q, which is then it's worth doing well. P, the job is worth doing well. We can conclude with Q. All right. If P then Q is premise 1. Premise 2, the job is worth doing, or P. And then the conclusion. I know it seems awkward, and you're probably wondering, why are we making this more awkward? The sentence, if the job is worth doing, then the job is worth doing, therefore it's worth doing well. These seem pretty straightforward. Why are we putting the P's and the Q's there? It's to draw out the structure of the logic. When we begin to see the logic, and in this case the logic is titled affirming the antecedent, this will become valuable later on when we're doing other kinds of arguments. So we're going to switch this up now and just do denying the consequent. Okay, so this one's denying the consequence, or modus tollens. Modus tollens. Okay, I can almost say that. And it looks like this. If P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. So we're just negating. But we're negating not the antecedent this time, where we didn't negate we affirmed the antecedent in the first one. Now we're negating, but we're not taking away or denying the antecedent. We're denying the consequent. That's the logic. It's weird, it's awkward, but now we're unveiling what's behind language and behind thought. To go one step further, and when you see the example of this one, it'll make more sense. It's what's called a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive syllogism. Okay. Either P or Q, this is the logic form, not P, therefore Q. So neither P nor Q. Not P, therefore Q. What in the world is going on? Well, this we can map onto an example like here, right here. Either Ralph walked the dog or he stayed home. He didn't walk the dog, therefore he stayed home. You're given an option in that first premise, this or that. He can't do both at the same time. He can't be walking the dog and staying home, which, if we push this hard enough, we might be able to argue he could do that. But that's not the point. We're just looking at superficial logic structure now. The disjunctive syllogism. Either he did this or he did that. We pick one of the two, therefore we get the response at the bottom, he stayed home. It's just that simple. Affirming the antecedent, denying the consequent, disjunctive syllogism, all of this is meant to drive home that logic comes in different forms, arguments come in different forms, and it's drawing our eye to these so that we can see them a little better. Not perfect, and the terminology is weird, but we're starting somewhere. All right, the last bit of today's little talk, I want to talk about diagramming arguments. This was of significance to me, especially when I started my university career and I learned about it. It's basically this. So you're looking through material and you're trying to make sense of it, and you're expected at university to write essays to explain these complex ideas and to explain that you know what's going on. Okay. But maybe not university, maybe again, you're doing a presentation at work or something like that. Wherever you are in life. And these things are complicated, and these arguments are nuanced, and I'm not familiar with them, and I'm not sure what's what. Well, let's go through an example, and we're going to diagram the logic. A couple of examples. The first thing you do when you want to make sense of someone's argument, it's helpful to look at the language for key indicator words, either premise or conclusion indicator words, like therefore, or since, or because. These are just natural. We're used to them in our language. When someone says therefore, you're pretty sure there's a conclusion coming up. If someone says because, you're pretty sure what's going on in that sentence because that's what these words do. So try and pick out these key words in this convoluted argument that you're examining. And then go even further, and if you can paste this into a Word document or get it onto paper somehow, go through and put a number for every statement. Every statement. Remember, a statement or claim is something that can be true or false. So you're not going to be putting a number around a question necessarily or a declaration of emotion. You're going to be putting it around statement, numbers by statements. Literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. That's to help begin to refine what we're dealing with. Then the fun stage, you go through each of these. Let's say you have 15 of these. You'll actually have a pen in your hand on a piece of paper, and you will cross out on your desktop, you'll cross out what doesn't work, what's irrelevant, what's repetitious, what's not actually an argument, like if it was a question or a command or something like that. You'll literally cross it out. And with this step alone, you will have significantly reduced your effort in trying to understand complex ideas and complex materials. Because suddenly you'll have, and I've seen this, you have an entire page of material, and when you really go through and you examine what this person's saying, if their style is sloppy, 75-80% of that page is just gobbledygook. You can take it out, and the argument they're trying to make is actually quite small. This is huge. But then to go even further so that you understand it, you'll diagram it. So check this out, just as a preliminary introduction. So here's an example right here. I'm trying to highlight it. There, it worked this time. Yay. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. That's for sure. Therefore, Trudeau being elected is good for Canada. Okay. This is obviously a very simplistic argument. It's not a very strong argument. He didn't detail what his ideas were. I mean, there's a lot more we should do to make this strong, but we're just trying to figure out the logic again. We're just trying to figure out the basics. Number 1, you can see that sentence. Number 2, that sentence. Number 3. Okay, you get it. Why is number 2 here redundant? If you think about it for a second, he's repeating himself or herself, whoever wrote this. Justin Trudeau has a great idea for preserving the natural environment. That's for sure. Well, it doesn't really add anything. It doesn't clarify anything. It's not new information, so it's redundant. You can cross it out. We have therefore as an indicator word, so underlying that, it's a good idea, just so you remember where it is. And if you've been paying attention to the sentence, you're like, okay, I have some sense maybe of what the conclusion is. In this case, being elected is good for Canada, right? And why is this the conclusion? Because the other part supports it. The other part is what's trying to convince me that he would be good for Canada. Well, this is what the diagram would look like. Number 1 is in a square. Number 1 is what we would call a premise, right? It leads somewhere. And this arrow is telling us where it leads. It's showing the logic that's leading us to number 3, which is number 3 in the sentence here, which is the conclusion. It's really just that simple. He has great ideas for preserving the environment. That's a claim, right? It's a claim that could be true or false. There's a little bit of messy stuff there, that's for sure. So we just take that out, and we get to the conclusion. We could change this up, and we could make the square a circle and the circle a square. We could make all kinds of different shapes for these. We don't need to use 1 and 3. We could use A or C. We could do all kinds of different, but just getting the logic patterns down. Unfortunately, life is rarely this simple. Arguments are rarely this simple. Here's a complicated one. See what you think. And I've seen this example in at least 3 different textbooks over the years. So apparently it's a popular example. There's no question in my mind. I therefore maintain that Colonel Mustard is the murderer, because if he did it, he would probably have blood stains on the sleeve of his shirt. The blood stains are tiny, but they are there. Any observant person could see them. Also, the murder weapon was in the Colonel's reach for quite a while before the crime was committed, and since all the people in the house at the time, he alone does not have an airtight alibi, he must be the killer. So, okay, fine. A single paragraph. But there's a lot going on in the single paragraph. There's definitely an argument, and we hear about this right at the very close to the very beginning, right? Therefore, I maintain. So therefore is that key word for a conclusion. But there are a couple of other words that kind of tip us off. Because and since kind of get us thinking. So that was step 1. We're trying to figure out what is the conclusion and what are the premises. So we're looking for these indicator words. After we do that, we start to number things. Ignore that. That's a typo. It's not supposed to be there. So here's what it looks like, numbered out and underlined. I'm trying. Come on, won't let me go down. It looks like this. Okay, fine. Now, the crossing out of the junk part is intimidating for a lot of people. It's intimidating for me because you never know. Maybe I'm crossing out something that's really not important. That's why you don't maybe want to scratch it out completely. You just want to put a single line through it just to go back and maybe this was important after all. But look what was scratched out here. There's no question in my mind. That's not really relevant. That's not a reason for why we should accept the conclusion. It's not even it's not certainly not the conclusion. There's no question in my mind, so we can take that out. And number 5, any observant person could see them. That would be a hard stretch to call that a reason. It's almost a flippant, oh, hey, do you have eyes? You should be able to see it. That doesn't really give us a reason for anything. It's kind of dismissive and contemptuous, actually, in a way. And number 7, only part of number 7 gets striked out. He must be the killer. Why? Because that's just repeating what we already have. What's left? We have something like this. Therefore, because, and since. And this is the diagram of these logical relationships. The conclusion is number 2. So number 2, therefore, okay, we've got that. And as we saw before, these squares, kind of like rectangles, but let's call them squares. These are all premises that lead somewhere. Great. But wait a minute. We have 3 and 4 that are underlined. And this is something we're going to see a lot in life. These are called dependent or linked premises, and it just means that they're supporting one another. So number 3, because if he did it, he would probably have blood stains on the sleeve of his shirt. And number 4, the blood stains are tiny, but they are there. These two work together. So this is your judgment needs to kick in. When you're reading something, you need to be able to discern, wait, do these help each other? If they do, then they're dependent or they're linked in some way, and then I can underline it. And if they're independent, that is, they can work on their own, then I don't need to do that. 6 and 7 work completely on their own as independent premises that help lead us to that conclusion. So don't panic when you see the underlining, and don't panic when you see there are a lot of premises. If you're writing a PhD dissertation or something, you could have hundreds of premises that lead to a conclusion. And of course, we have the standard arrows that are showing us the relationship of that logic, where that logic is going. Whew, okay, so we've actually covered quite a bit. What is inductive? What is deductive? How do we begin to evaluate arguments? That is, what are we kind of looking for in terms of dependability and credibility? We've begun to look at patterns or forms, different patterns or forms in arguments. They come in different packages. We've looked briefly at modus ponens, the way of affirming the antecedent, and modus tollens, denying the consequent. Yikes, we've got lots of fancy terminology there. And we have a very practical way of digesting some of these really big ideas through diagrams. Okay, let's take a breather. I think we've made a pretty good, I think we've taken some pretty good steps there. All right, on to the next video, everyone.